Hey everyone. Today I am joined by Sophie Navati, who's the founder of Formation, and we're going to be talking about the 4 common mistakes in preparing for a system design interview. So Sophie was a really early engineer at Facebook, aka Meta, and also at Nextdoor. And now she runs a company called Formation.dev, which the whole purpose is to prepare people for the technical interview to get into these top FAANG companies. So Sophie, thanks so much for joining.
Rahul, thanks for having me. Super excited to have this conversation.
Yeah, so diving right into system design, the idea is you are trying to evaluate a candidate's skill for building a real software system. And I'll say from my own experience, and I think for the experience of many people watching, it's probably one of the hardest interviews to prepare for because when
hmm
you go to college, like when you go to school, you don't really use that muscle. And if you follow a tutorial online, if you're building like a toy application, you also likely don't have the level of complexity or scale when it comes to what is truly being evaluated at a company like Meta or Google for system design. And so what I thought would be helpful is for us to go through a bunch of the common patterns that you have seen people fail or screw up their preparation for system design. And there's a lot more about what you share and talk about in a course that you made on Taro. I'll leave a link for that in the description. But why don't we dive right in? The first one that I thought would be really interesting to talk about is communication or a lack of communication in a system design interview. How does that manifest in your experience?
And just as a little bit of context, in terms of the mistakes that we see, these are generally mistakes that we see for people who are already studying systems design, right? So if you have like a lack of theoretical knowledge and you don't actually know like what a load balancer does, or you're not familiar with the different types of data storage technologies, like that's not necessarily the gap that any of the mistakes that we've kind of like pointed out are trying to get at. Like these are generally things where people are studying and they're learning and they're consuming a ton of content online, oftentimes like async content, and then not able to translate that into performance in a system design interview. And communication, I think, is like a great one to start with because it is exactly that. Like a lot of people I'm seeing are consuming a lot of async content, but they're not actually turning that into practice, which is, the fact that system design is a very much two-way conversation. It is not just about writing out an answer, which coding interviews, they're also communication, but it is a little bit about writing out a solution, right? So you can practice for that a little bit easier. A system design interview, let's get it straight, is a conversation where you are giving and taking constantly. And that's kind of part of what makes it a little bit hard to practice for. And
Yeah.
what we see people doing then as a result is, first of all, people get nervous. And so sometimes like the problem is just that they like don't communicate at all because they're worried that they're going to say something wrong, right? And that's really obviously going to cause you need to find ways to be able to unblock yourself. And we talk a little bit in the videos on like ways to get unstuck if you feel like you don't know how to take the next step. The other thing is kind of just not utilizing the communication channels that you have at your disposal within the system design interview. Sometimes people, are communicating a lot verbally, but they're not actually communicating via like diagrams or text written down. Like in coding interviews, it is oftentimes easier because you're communicating through the code, which you have to write down. But with system design, you don't really have to write anything down. And so people kind of under communicate through like visual channels. And then I would say kind of like the last thing that we see is that, when people are communicating, they're communicating the what of their decisions. Like they're saying, I'm going to choose this component, which is going to connect to here, etc. But they're not actually explaining the why. And the why is actually way more important than the what. And we talk a little bit about like ways to offer more in that regard.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I think one that's really helpful. One big unlock for me is when I heard that, unlike a leak code problem or a DSA problem where there probably is a right answer and like a runtime that you're trying to achieve or a space complexity you're trying to achieve, in system design, there's no such thing as the correct answer. A lot of what is being evaluated, to your point, is why are you building it this way? Like, what are the constraints you're optimizing for? And that's where communication is being tested just as much as your technical depth. And so I think that's a huge mindset shift that a lot of people don't think about when they're preparing for system design.
yeah, and again, it's very much two-way. I think that people often get stuck because they think that they're supposed to be producing an answer at all times, right?
Mm.
And it's actually not that at all. You're receiving a lot more from your interviewer as well, right? I don't know exactly the balance, but I would go as far as to say that it could even be as much as 50-50. It's probably a little less than that. But you are asking your interviewer to kind of give you as much as you're giving back in terms of like constraints and like product depth and they should be kind of providing you the decision-making criteria essentially for you to be making trade-offs in terms of decisions that you're making. Like in a vacuum, there's no decisions to be made. Only with
Right.
constraints and things that are optimized for can you actually make a decision in these interviews.
It should feel like a collaboration. I like that.
Very much so. Yeah.
The let's go on to number two, which is thinking like an engineer.
Yeah.
So can you talk about what that means and how does that manifest?
I think we have actually hinted at some of this already with the communication, which is really thinking about kind of the why when it comes to your decision making. And also, a big thing is like solving kind of like the specific problem that is presented to you. And again, I think I mentioned, a lot of these mistakes are things that we see people making when they are studying. And so, one of the things that we see people do is kind of just try to follow a formula, right? They see like system design interview goes through these 6 different steps. And so, I'm on step 1 now. And so I'm going to draw boxes. I've seen, these are the common boxes that are in any system design interview, and these are how they're connected. And they're kind of building a very generic solution as opposed to a solution really targeted at the problem at hand.
Mm,
And a lot of times that will lead to people speaking a lot in hypotheticals, right? Like, here's this technology and here's the pros and cons of it. But you shouldn't actually just be just telling the interviewer, what are the pros and cons of a system. You should actually be making decisions as to what you should be doing. And again, this is where kind of communication also comes in, right? Like instead of telling the interviewer what the pros and cons are and then the decisions on almost the interviewer, you should be asking the interviewer to provide you constraints enough with which you can now make a judgment call as an engineer on what you should be doing. And that judgment call is very much the kind of thinking like an engineer. It's very scary to do because you are, again, some of these decisions, it's almost like there's not like 100% correct answer, right? Like,
mm,
there's like an 80% correct answer. And then there's like, even the decisions that you are making, there's cons to it as well, right? And so it's hard to put yourself out there and like put an opinion there as the correct answer because it is an opinion. But without making that opinion and that judgment call to make a trade-off, then you're not really demonstrating your ability to like think and make judgment calls as an engineer.
Another way I think that this might show up is engineers often are kind of have tunnel vision into the happy path. So
Oh,
everything will
yes.
work,
Yeah.
and there's like we're not gonna. I think like a very mature thing to think about in a system design is to ask, hey, how might this fail? What are edge cases or scalability issues that we don't expect to happen, but like how should we handle it if it does, right? And I think that's a very common like engineer mindset, but it helps to take a step back and evaluate more holistically what might go wrong.
There's a system out there that probably meets the happy path of like 80% of the prompts out there. And a lot of
Yeah.
times people basically just draw that. And actually that 80% solution is like what you want to spend like 1 minute of your time on. And then all
Mhm.
of the rest of the time is in exploring kind of the edge cases and nuances of this specific problem.
Which kind of segues into the third point, which is about the adaptability of the
Yeah.
system design interview. It's not just, okay, I watched a YouTube video or I read this guide and I just regurgitate that in the interview. It's
Hmm.
about driving the design, which is the
Yeah.
third pattern that you brought up of mistakes in interview prep. Can you talk more about that one?
As I think system design content is becoming more prevalent, people are learning the format of the system design interview and just kind of like letting that guide them as opposed to letting their engineering thinking guide the problem solving process. And so, almost the first thing that you should do when you're provided a system design prompt is identify what is different about this prompt. Like what is different about this compared to like the 80% solution that we just mentioned, right? Like the generic solution that works for almost all prompts. What are the key issues that make this particular prompt challenging? And then immediately focus on solving that problem. Like you should be
Mm.
spending most of your time on those differences as opposed to, something that we see is kind of like, again, they're following the script and they're kind of leaving some of those like tougher challenges to be solved later. And, as an engineer, I think another thing is that you have to have opinions, right? Like we were just saying how it's important to make judgment calls and put your opinions out there, right? If you are just asking for permission the entire time and like someone else needs to tell you this is the correct solution, then you're not demonstrating oftentimes the level of seniority that, depends on also what level we're talking about. I think one thing is like the expectations for system design changes wildly from level to level compared to coding stays relatively the same. So there's definitely, but the more senior you get, the more actually opinionated you have to get, because the more in practice you're responsible for essentially having opinions and making judgment calls on the right things to do. So in terms of like driving the design, it's like really not just following a standard script. It's like really identifying what's unique about the problem and letting the challenges of the problem, guide the conversation, and really being kind of brave enough essentially to put yourself out there to make decisions essentially.
I wonder if you have thought about how an engineer should, be on, like, not avoid either extreme. Where on one extreme, they're asking for permission every few minutes. Oh, like, am I going in the right
Yeah.
direction? Should I go further? On the
Yep.
other extreme, being almost too stubborn
Yep.
with, oh,
Yep. Yep.
here
Yep.
is what we need to do as a design. How do you figure out how do you interact with the interviewer to find that happy medium?
I actually think that's a great question. It comes up a lot. And I think that this answer is actually very simple. So basically, so instead of saying like, what should I do? You make the statement of this is what we should do, and just add how does that sound? And that really, I think, meets the medium, because it gives the interviewer a moment to interject if there is a concern that he or she wants you to consider. But it also, you're putting your opinion out there first.
I like that. That makes sense. And it kind of goes back to the very first thing we talked about, which is communication. Like, it should feel like a
Yep.
collaboration, like a
Hmm.
two-way street. And let's move on to the last one, which is more of a meta mistake that people make. And again, like, I think you've hinted at this, or we've talked about it a couple times already. The last mistake that, you've often seen is the meta point of how engineers approach the preparation for system design.
I think people don't honestly need a lot more knowledge. Like there's so many videos out there that's covering every single type of, technology, and people aren't really missing access to that. They're missing access to like really practice opportunities and being able to actually, do system design, through conversation and get feedback on that. And so formation is really about creating opportunities to do guided interview practice, mock interview practice with real feedback, which is it is designed around kind of the gap that we see. And it is also the reason that we designed this video series the way that this is designed. Like it is, and I think we were just talking about this right before, is, it's oftentimes when you tell someone how to do something, like the right way to do something, I find that like when they go to execute, it's still very hard because it's very high level. It's very hard to emulate something that's like, described in theory. And so, we decided to try to almost make it a little bit practice-like by showing, counter examples of people trying to do the advice that's giving on the internet and like the common problems that actually occur, and showing in the video series, we kind of show like the exact same situation, but like a good way to handle it and a bad way to handle it. And like hopefully the more concrete examples allow people to sort of, try to apply some of the principles in practice. But in terms of things that you can do on your own, right? First of all, like I think there's different degrees to it. If you're completely on your own, I actually think just like behavioral interviews, just try talking out loud
Yeah,
some
I like
of
that.
like your, ask yourself some questions. And like when you're going through, some of these prompts and learning, pros and cons, just try saying it out loud instead of just reading, right? And another step, you can try recording yourself and listening to it back. And this is exact same for behavioral interviews, right? Once you listen to it back, you might have some, it'll sound different, I think, and you'll probably have some feedback for yourself just doing that. Another kind of mini tip with that, like over recording, is like try putting some space between your actual when you actually answered it and when you're listening to it, because you kind of remember it less clearly, so you can kind of almost judge it, on a more like third, like unbiased way.
The course you are talking about on Taro, I think it really is one of the highest quality courses out there for what
Appreciate
to
that.
what to avoid about system design interview prep. So I will definitely leave a link for that. And I think one thing I really appreciate about you, Sophie, is that not only have you worked as a very senior engineer in the industry at Meta and Nextdoor, but also you've literally helped thousands of people now to land these amazing jobs. And so everything you're saying, everything your team has developed is backed by tons and tons of evidence. And so I'm super excited for people to check out that course and learn more about formation too.
Yeah, awesome. And honestly, to everyone in your community as well, we would love to hear the feedback on some of our content. We're definitely trying to approach this in a different way. Would love to hear if it's like, useful or not. We're happy to also make more content or answer questions on our existing content. Happy to engage with your audience as well in any way that we can be helpful or useful.
That's perfect. And we've been longtime partners with Formation, so I'll leave a link for
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
our special Taro link in the description. description. I'll leave a link for your LinkedIn, Sophie. Amazing. Thanks so much. And thanks everyone for watching.